All right, we have come to the subject in the book of Proverbs of wealth and poverty, the rich and the poor. And you may already be imagining when you hear poor, you might have in your mind this negative idea, or you might be thinking, you might instantly think, yeah, a bunch of lazy people. And then you might also be thinking, well, maybe they're not lazy. Maybe there's nothing they could do. Maybe they were made poor for something that's not there, and you feel compassion, and you have a hard time with those two emotions. You have this feeling like they should not be lazy. They should get up and work hard, and also you're compassionate, and you got like this warring thing going on. And when you think of the rich, you think, I would really like to be rich, but I really don't like the rich. You kind of have this warring thing going on in your own mind. Well, Proverbs is going to give us a lot of nuance, we'll look at it this way, and then look at it from this side, and then look at it the other way. And I think that's wonderful. As we've been going through chapter 10 to give us our topics, because chapters 1 through 9 of Proverbs gives us this opening sermon, this long opening sermon as an introduction to Proverbs. Chapter 10 through 29 gives us individual proverbs. Some of them are grouped together on purpose to give similar proverbs. And every now and then you'll have two verses that are one proverb, or maybe sometimes three. But usually most of what you're going to find from chapters 10 through 29 are each verse is its own proverb, and it's not really connected to the proverb before it, except maybe when the person compiling it put it together, they thought, well, this one goes with that one, and I'll put that one together, right? So when we're reading this, we're not reading it like we'd read a regular chapter of the Bible and looking for the context about the clue of what this means. We've already got the context. It's in chapters 1 through 9, and it tells us what wisdom is, what foolishness is. Wisdom is to live your life in a manner that pleases God, because God created you to do that thing. And so it's wise then to do that. And foolishness is living your life in a way that displeases God, right? So those are your two things. Righteousness equals wisdom. Sin equals foolishness, because sin is disobeying God who created you, and that's foolish. Well, wisdom is righteous because it's doing what is pleasing to God. So we have those two things. Now in chapter 10 of Proverbs, we come to verse number 3. The Lord will not suffer the soul of the righteous to famish, but he casteth away the substance of the wicked. Here is, he will not suffer the soul of the righteous to famish, or to suffer hunger, meaning being poor, but casteth away the substance, like all the wealth of the wicked. Verse 4, he becometh poor that dealeth with a slack hand, but the hand of the diligent maketh rich. So these are two individual proverbs that happen to be placed next to each other that are both really dealing with poverty and wealth. One of them deals more with laziness, or dealing with a slack hand, not really being diligent about your work, the thing that God has given you to do, where the other one is dealing more with wealth and poverty. And in this verse, we're given this idea that the Lord will not suffer the soul of the righteous to famish. He's using words about rich and poor, but here he's talking about soul, like an inward truth, not an outward truth, a truth about your soul. He says, maybe the soul, I'm going to read between the lines, maybe the body of a righteous person might be hungry, but a person who's doing right, his soul won't be hungry. He will not suffer the soul of the righteous to famish. But all the physical substance of the wicked is going bye-bye one day. So this is an end-of-time thing. One day we stand before God, and those who are righteous because they've chosen Christ as their Savior and stand in the righteousness of Christ, those people are not hungry. In the long run, they're filled. They're satisfied. They go into heaven. But the wicked, everything they built all their lives is gone. They don't take it with them. It's gone. They're cast into hell. Their substance is cast away. And it's like they had nothing to begin with. So we have this principle, and this introduces a theme to us that we're going to follow throughout the book of Proverbs, and that is the theme of wealth, of the rich and the poor, those who are wealthy and those who are in poverty. Now, before we can examine this theme, we've got to lay a foundation from the Old Testament law. The reason for this is because Proverbs is Solomon drawing from the Old Testament law to show how pleasing the God who gave us these instructions is a good idea. It would be a bad, foolish thing to displease that God. It would be wise to please him. Here's the things he's told us to do. Here's how that plays out in everyday life. So let's look at what the law says about the rich and the poor. A few things. First, we'll look at Exodus 23. Exodus 23 gives us a really potent rule concerning the rich and the poor. Exodus 23, we'll just start in verse 1. This is rules for judges. This is rules for a courtroom, essentially, if I were to translate it to today's vernacular. Thou shalt not raise a false report, meaning giving a false testimony. Put not thine hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. Neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment, to wrestle against true judgment. By the way, all this stuff happened to Jesus when he was put to death. False judgment. Verse 3, neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause. What this means is you are not to say, this man is poor, I'm going to show favoritism to him because he's poor. Since he's poor, we should have compassion on him in a way that we wouldn't have compassion on someone else. This is a courtroom. That his wealth, whether he's poor or not, shouldn't be part of this. Don't show favoritism to him because he's poor. Then it goes on, if thou meet thine enemy's ox or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely bring it back to him again. If thou see the ass of him that hateth thee lying under his burden, and wouldest forbear to help him, and thou shalt surely help with him. Thou shalt not wrest the judgment of thy poor in this cause. So now it's saying, don't wrestle against the poor in judgment either. There's two things given here. Don't show favoritism to the poor because they're poor and you're compassionate on them. They don't get any special treatment in a court of law. And also, don't oppress them because they're poor and you'd rather rule with the rich guy because you think you might get a cut. That's not the way we do it. The way the amount of money they have doesn't have to do with it at all. This is why many systems of justice systems in our world today are derived from the Old Testament law, from the Jewish justice system, and we even see it what's the symbol of the justice system, right? It's a lady with a balance, a scale, and it's got to be equal scales. And what is she? She's blindfolded. She's not to take into account whether it's poor or wealthy or who this is. Is this right? Is this just? That's the standard of justice. And in those days, judicial sentences would be given mostly in the gate of a city. You would go to a city, and all the elders of the city would gather around the gate, and you would go plead your cause. The rich man would have the ability to plead his cause better. He'd come with a whole host of people that would say, yeah, he was right. And it would be very easy for the people at the gate of the city, the judges, to go along with the crowd because the rich guys paid them all to come, right? The poor man is going to have a harder time arguing his case and convincing the judges to see it his way. But God put in place in his law a ruling. You are not to let that affect your judgment. It's either right or it's wrong. Doesn't matter if that guy's rich or if he's poor. You don't side with him because he's poor. You don't side against him because he's poor. None of that can be part of it. So you can't show favoritism to the poor or to the rich. This is repeated for us in Leviticus 19:15. You may not show favoritism to the poor or to the mighty in judgment. You can look that up in your own time when you want. We'll move right along. The other thing is you must not oppress the poor. There is a host of verses in the Old Testament law that refer to not oppressing the poor. Here's a couple examples. Verse 22, Exodus 22, verse 25 says, If thou lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as a usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. Meaning, if you're going to lend money to a poor person in Israel, God is saying, you cannot charge them interest. If they need the money and they're going to pay it back, lend them the money. If they don't need the money, don't lend them the money, but don't charge them interest. You can't do that because they're poor. That's just taking advantage of a poor person who needs money. Don't charge them interest. Now, this is not something we follow today, like not at all, but that was the rule from the Lord. Now, he also says in the book of Deuteronomy not to charge interest to anyone in Israel, but he says it first here in Exodus, saying, Deuteronomy was written later. Exodus, right up front, make sure before we get to the law, where don't use usury to anyone in Israel. He says first, make sure you're not doing it right now to a poor person. Definitely not to a poor person. Exodus 30. We'll skip that one. That one's about having the same offering for rich and poor for redeeming yourself. Like you have to redeem yourself from the service of God. And it was a half shekel, so it wasn't a large offering, but it was the same. In that offering, it was equal. Rich or poor, doesn't matter. It's the same offering. Which means that as far as our standing with God, we're all equal. There's no difference between a rich person and a poor person as far as our value. It's the value of a person, basically, is what it's saying. The same value in the same sense. But in Leviticus 14, we're told, verse 21, we'll just do a couple in Leviticus and I'll read the rest to you. Leviticus 14, verse 21. Talking about the offerings for a sin offering. It says, and if he be poor, meaning the person coming to bring a sin offering, and cannot get so much, then he shall take one lamb for a trespass offering to be waived, to make atonement for him, the 1/10 deal of fine flour, and so on. So there's special offerings allowed for the poor if they can't afford a greater offering. You could see that even in verse 22, which goes along with Luke chapter 2, where Mary and Joseph bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons as an offering to the temple instead of a lamb. It says this, verse 22, and 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, such as he is able to get. So again, there's provisions made for the poor. We're not to oppress the poor. We're not to force on them something that they can't meet. Leviticus 25, verse 25 says that we are to allow for the poor to redeem their property if they had to sell it because of their poverty. They have to have the ability to get it back, to redeem it back. In Leviticus 25, verse 35 through 55, it says over and over again, it gives rules about the poor. It says that you're to relieve a brother who's poor. Your job is to help them. You must help them if they're a brother and they're poor. If you loan them anything, you can't loan it to them with interest. You cannot enslave them, but you can hire them. You can hire them as a servant, but you can't enslave them. They can't, because they're your brother and they're poor. And if someone sells himself as a slave to someone who's not a Jew, who's in the land, then he has to be able to be redeemed back. He can be redeemed back by one of his relatives who can pay off his debt, redeem him back. So remember, God is not only caring for the poor, he's saying, you guys are the possessors of this land. Your family gets a plot of land, and you're to hold that plot of land and make it productive and make it fruitful until the Messiah comes and establishes his kingdom. Like, that's what Israel's doing. Their whole purpose was to hold a piece of land until the Messiah came to rule it. So when your family gets in there and you get your inheritance, of the tribes of Israel, that's going to stay in your family. If you have to sell that because you're poor, it has to go through a roundabout whatever needs to happen, but it's ending up back in your family. It's not going to be taken out of your family forever. It has to be able to be redeemed. You have to be able to come back to it. All of that stuff, that's your land for good. Even if it's, even if you have to use it for some financial urgency. In Leviticus 25, verse 47, again, provisions made to redeem a poor man who sold himself into servitude. Deuteronomy 15, verse 4, you forgive the debts of brothers in the year of Jubilee to combat poverty. This is really interesting. Deuteronomy 15, verse 34. Maybe it's not 15 because it's not 34. It's verse 4. Like there's not 34 verses in Deuteronomy 15. Deuteronomy 15 verse 4. This is about the year of Jubilee. Every 7 years was considered a Sabbath year for Israel, and on the 7th year out of every 7, they would have a year of Sabbath or a year of Jubilee. And on that it says, verse 1, at the end of every 7 years thou shalt make a release. And this is the manner of the release. Every creditor that lendeth aught to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not exact of his neighbor or of his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. Of a foreigner thou mayest exact it again, but that which is thine with thy brother, thine hand shall release. So every 7 years, anything you loaned to another Jew, another Israelite, is forgiven. They're now, it's done. It's released. If it's a Gentile, non-Jewish person, you can keep going after them for the loan. But a Jewish person, it's done every 7 years. If they don't pay, yeah. Of a foreigner thou mayest exact it again, but that which is thine with thy brother, thine hand shall release. Save when there shall be no poor among you. The point is, this is until there's no more poor person in the land of Israel, which won't happen, of course, until the Messiah comes. But until then, there's always going to be a poor person. For the Lord shall greatly bless thee in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance to possess it. He said, you're going to have more than enough, so make sure that the poor are cared for. Only if thou carefully hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God to observe all these commandments which I command thee this day. So, there's the year of Jubilee where debts were all forgiven. Then there's especially to combat poverty. All of this was so that the land of Israel wasn't impoverished. Now, Proverbs gets into the wisdom of these laws in it's gonna blow your minds. I really wish we could just do the whole thing today, but we'd be here 3 or 4 hours. I mean, it's a lot of stuff that Proverbs has to say about it. So we'll have to just do the best with our memories to remember what we're looking at, because all this is just foundational. You might say, well, how did that work? Proverbs is going to get in and show the wisdom behind these laws. That's just quite fascinating. Deuteronomy 24, you were to restore collateral to a poor man that he needs to use at night. So if he made a pledge, I'm going to do this, here's the collateral, the down payment for that, and he had to put down his blanket for collateral, or he had to put down like his nightgown for collateral or something, something that he would need at night. You were not to keep the collateral from a poor man. By the end of the day, he was supposed to have it back, so he could use it. He could have it by that evening. He had the collateral back. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not still collateral. It just means he gets to keep using it in the meantime while it's collateral. So that's only because he's poor and he needs it. So there's all kinds of laws about not oppressing the poor. So there's 2 things we've seen so far. In the law, it's very clear, in judicial things, you are not to show favoritism to the poor or to the rich. In other matters, there's all kinds of laws that make sure that the poor are not oppressed, that they're cared for. They're not overly oppressed. There's no interest, all this stuff charged on them to keep them down, keep them poor, right? Then there's also commandments that you meet the needs of the poor. So I'll give an example in Exodus 23. We won't turn there, but I'll tell you what's there. Exodus 23, verse 11. The Sabbath year, that 7th year out of every 7 years, the last of every 7 years, was the year of Jubilee. And another thing that had to happen during that year, the people of Israel were not to plant anything in their fields. Every other year, all the other 6 years, they were to plant in their fields and harvest and plant and harvest. And God promised, I'm going to give you more than enough so that the 7th year, you won't have to plant anything in your field. I'm going to give you so much that you'll have more than enough for the 7th year to go 1 year without planting. And in that year, they were not to plant their field, but whatever grew out of their field was for the poor people. The people who didn't have enough to make it through the year, they got whatever grew in that person's field during that 7th year. It's just pretty amazing. God said, I'm not just going to take care of the whole nation as a whole. I'm going to take care of the individuals. And I'm putting laws in place so that even the poor individuals in Israel are going to have something care. I'm going to care so much beyond what the rich people need so that the poor people will have something as well. Pretty amazing. Leviticus 19, they were on the in-between years, all the other 6 years when they were growing in their field, they were not to completely clean off the field. When they're harvesting from the field, they're supposed to leave the edges. You know, when you just kind of go around the corners, just leave the corner there. Don't go back and harvest that. That is for the poor people to come along and pick off of. When you do your field, get all your harvest, but leave stragglers around. Don't clean it all the way. You know, make sure you leave the edges for the poor people. Then in Deuteronomy 15. Now, all of this requires poor people to actually go out and work to pick the field. I mean, it's not like they're going to go deliver it to them so they can lay on their couch watching TV, okay? But there was provision made for them, right? Deuteronomy 15. You were not to harden your heart in helping the poor. We're right here in Deuteronomy 14 or 15 already. So let's go to verse 7. If there be among you a poor man of any one of thy brethren within any of thy gates in thy land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not harden thine heart, nor shut thine hand from thy poor brother. But thou shalt open thine hand wide unto him, and shalt surely lend him sufficient for his need in that which he wanteth. By the way, wanted, this is another thing that's tough. In the King James, want means need. We think want means whatever I desire, right? That's not what it's saying, okay? Whatever he actually needs. Now, this is a key, I think, to a lot of these passages that we're going to see. We're not talking about giving somebody something that's going to encourage them to be more lazy, right? If laziness is the reason that a person is poor, then these are not applying to that person because it's giving them what they need. If someone is desperately in need, in order to help my family, I need to plant this field. To plant this field, I need some seed. To get the seed, I need some money. I'm broke. Can I borrow some money so I can get some seed so I can plant this field and I'll pay you back? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to work. Now you're saying a need that this person has. He needs this. Okay. Now, because of that need, which the King James translated as want, but that's the Old English version of what the word means. It means need. Verse 9, beware that there be not a thought in thy wicked heart. I love how God just calls everybody in Israel wicked. We are all wicked, aren't we? We just have wicked hearts, don't we? Beware that there be not a thought in thy wicked heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of the release is at hand. Thine eye be evil against thy poor brother. Here's the man. He says, I really need some money to plant some seed to grow some food this year. And you're like, yeah, but next year is the 7th year, and I've got to forgive all debts. I'm not going to loan you any. Now all the poor people aren't going to get loans on the 6th year because the 7th year you have to forgive it. And God says, yeah, better not do that. Don't let that sneak into your heart. And then I be evil against thy poor brother, and thou givest him not, and he cry unto the Lord against thee, and it be sin unto thee. Thou shalt surely give him, and thine heart shall not be grieved when thou givest unto him, because that for this thing the Lord thy God shall bless thee, and all thy works, and in all that thou puttest thine hand to. For the poor shall never cease out of the land. Therefore I command thee, saying, Thou shalt open thine hand wide unto the poor, and to thy poor, and to thy needy in thy land. Jesus quotes this verse later when Judas says, hey, that box of ointment that was just broken and poured over his head, it could have been sold and the money could have been given to the poor. And Jesus said, Deuteronomy says that the poor will always be in the land. You'll always have poor to give to, but I won't always be in the land. He's the Messiah who's ultimately, when there is no more poor in the land, it's because the Messiah has returned, right? So, so we can see at least three things so far. In judgment, there was not to be favoritism to the poor or favoritism to the rich. It's supposed to be blind. There were laws put in place to make sure the poor were not oppressed or shoved down further. And there were laws put in place that required people to loan to poor people if they gave out loans. If that's what they were doing, was giving out loans, they would still loan to poor people. They couldn't or refused loans to poor people. And then there's also a lot of references in the scriptures about how God is the one who gives them prosperity or poverty. I'll give you a couple, and we'll go to Deuteronomy 58 for it. But I'll give you a couple other references in case you're taking notes or maybe watching it later. Did I say Deuteronomy 58? Because there's not 58 chapters in Deuteronomy. I think I meant Deuteronomy 8. Let me see if I actually meant Deuteronomy 8. See if that's where I'm... It might be 28, honestly, for all I know. At least I found my Bible. Wednesday, I lost my Bible. Yeah, it's Deuteronomy 28. That's what it is. Here's a couple more references if they're correct. Deuteronomy 8, 11 through 20 talks a lot about how your wealth comes from God. Deuteronomy 28, 11 says that, which we won't read just now because we're going to start in verse 15, says that the Lord, Yahweh, will make you plenteous if you obey His law. This is repeated in Deuteronomy 30, verse 9. In Deuteronomy 31, verse 20, and Deuteronomy 32, verse 14, God says that when He makes Israel fat and blesses them so much, He is predicting and prophesying that they're going to eventually say, we've got all we need, and turn away from God, which they did. But it was all a point that God was the one who made them so prosperous that they turned away from God. Like, God's the one who gave them that in the first place. Deuteronomy 6, 11, 8, 10 through 12, and 11, 15 says God will fill Israel with good when they serve Him faithfully. And here in Deuteronomy 28, 15 through 57, there is a great poverty that they're going to be under if they'll turn away from God. Deuteronomy 28, verse 15, we'll read just a couple of these verses. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord to obey, to observe, to do all His commandments and His statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. Cursed shalt thou be in the city, and cursed shalt thou be in the field. Cursed shall be thy basket and thy store. Cursed shall be the fruit of thy body, and the fruit of thy land, the increase of thy kine, and the flocks of thy sheep. Cursed shalt thou be when thou comest in, and cursed shalt thou be when thou goest out. The Lord shall send upon thee cursing, vexation, and rebuke. And it goes on and on for all the way till verse 57. The cursings of God. The point that we're learning in these passages of the law is that wealth and poverty comes from God. And for Israel, He was going to send poverty when they refused to obey His commandments, and wealth when they obeyed. Now, we have to be careful translating that as a one-to-one comparison to America. Okay? It is true, and we're going to find this as we look at the book of Proverbs, that the laws of God, following His commandments, tend to make someone more prosperous in a financial way. They do tend towards that. But there's a different set of promises for us than were promised to Israel. Israel was a nation that was to hold this land until the Messiah came. And that's what they were doing. So God promised them blessing in this land, like physical blessings, if they would follow Him, and physical poverty if they would not, because they were to keep following Him until the Messiah came. We are a little different, right? America is not God's chosen land or God's chosen people. We are God's people in that we're saved, and we have eternal prosperity in heaven, of course. So we don't have the same promise that there's going to be a one-to-one comparison. Everyone who does right is going to be rich, and everyone who does wrong is going to be poor. That's not correct. There are teachers who teach this. Kenneth Copeland's probably the biggest one that most people know about. He teaches about how if you are pleasing God, you're going to be rich. And if you're not rich, it's because you need to have more faith and please God more, because God is going to make everyone who pleases Him rich. This is not the case. As we will see in the book of Proverbs. So we're not going to go through it today, but I'm going to give you the outline for what we're going to try to cover in the future, just as a way to show you that it's, because I know there's a lot of questions that are in our minds as we're thinking about this, just looking through the law. So let me give you some of the things. We're going to see several verses in several Proverbs in the book that are going to give us the value of wisdom. It's just so much better than money. Wisdom is to be preferred above money. Then we're going to see that several verses that talk about how wisdom does affect financial things. Like if you have the wisdom of God, you're following God, it's going to help you in practical financial ways. There are things that are going to be better just naturally because you were wise about it. But then it says that righteousness is good mainly because it pleases God. And riches comes from God, and so does poverty. Riches and poverty are in the hand of God. So there's going to be a lot of discussion about that, a lot of verses, a lot of Proverbs about that. Then it's going to give us Proverbs about how the focus on money then is bad. The love of money is the root of all evil. That's not in Proverbs, but that's a conclusion that comes from Proverbs. So since wisdom is the chief thing, and really all riches are in God's hands, even though wisdom does generally help us make better decisions that tend towards better financial decisions, ultimately it's in God's control. So then if we make the goal of our lives money, we're not going to get it. Or we're not going to get the money that we think. Even a wicked man who gets a lot of the money is going to end up in destruction when he dies, and it's going to be all vanity. It's wasted. So then our goal shouldn't be the money. Our goal should be God. And then God gives us what he pleases, poverty or riches, whatever he chooses. But God should be the goal. Then we're going to see a host of Proverbs that talk about how that go through a bad rich man. Here's a bad rich man. Here's a foolish man who's rich. And then we'll see a host of Proverbs that talk about a wise rich man. Here's what a wisdom looks like for a rich man. So it gives a foolish rich man, wise rich man. And then it goes and it says, oh, and by the way, the same thing goes for the poor. You have a whole host of Proverbs that talk about a foolish poor man. And there's even under that subsetting, you can go to all the passages about the sluggard that show that laziness produces poverty. But then it goes to the other side and it shows that not all poverty is produced by laziness. There's wise poor people as well. And here's the benefits of a wise poor person. So you got wisdom in the rich is good, and foolishness among the rich people is bad, is going to bring destruction. Wisdom among the poor is good, foolishness among the poor is bad. What's the common denominator? Wisdom. It's not their wealth. Right? The goal is wisdom. And then we'll see a host of verses that talk about how the requirements. So since the poor are needy, there's a whole host of verses that the Proverbs that talk about the neediness of the poor, how they are needy, and how God makes it clear that oppressing needy people is a sin. Therefore, there's a whole host of Proverbs that talk about how it is incumbent on someone who has the ability, who's been given more, to help those that are in need. We're going to talk about what it means to be in need and how we meet someone's need, not just hand them $100 to go waste at the liquor store. Okay, so there's a lot of nuance that we need to get into. Well, yeah, God's very important to God that we help the poor. But how do I help them? Am I actually helping them by handing them a $100 bill? Or is that just going to make them more lazy and more poor? And so we're gonna get into all of that. All of those aspects are dealt with in the book of Proverbs. So I'm looking forward to it. But it won't be next week. It won't be the week after that. It's going to take us a while to get through all these verses. But I'll leave you with one that I think will be our conclusion at the end. It's Proverbs 30, verses 8 and 9. Here, the prophet Agur is writing, and he says, "Remove far from me vanity and lies. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with food convenient for me, lest I be full and deny thee and say, 'Who is the Lord?' Or lest I be poor and steal and take the name of my God in vain." He got it, right? I'm not here for poverty. I don't want to be poor, but I also am not interested in being rich without wisdom. I'm just looking for you, Lord. I'm looking for wisdom. I want to do what pleases you. And that's the point, I think. All right, let's pray. Father in heaven, what a glorious comfort it is to know that your word even speaks to these great issues that we deal with day to day. Some of us either are poor or maybe have been poor. We understand what it's like to be poor. Some of us in our number might consider themselves rich or might say, man, I'd like to be rich someday. Wherever we're at, we know that whatever we have has been given to us by you, and we pray that you'd help us to take what we have and use it faithfully in a way that pleases you. And we thank you that you've given us such clear instructions on what we should do. And even in the places where we have so many questions, you've dealt with that. You've answered that. You've given us understanding in these areas. So I pray that you help us as we dive into this over the next several weeks to find clear direction from you and then to go out and do it. And we thank you for these things. Bless us as we go from here.